Good evening, everyone. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood, New York, whose generous support makes our Spirit Alive programs possible. If you're logging on for the first time, my name is Sister Maria Pascuzzi, and I'm the director of Spirit Alive. Tonight, I want to add a special word of thanks to the Fitzgerald family, whose generous donation on behalf of their deceased brother, Johnny, is helping to sponsor tonight's roundtable on the priesthood, a much scrutinized and debated topic. There have been calls to abolish the priesthood, calls to redeem and reform it, calls to open up the priesthood to women and married men, and calls to make celibacy optional or abolish it altogether. Catholic priesthood is something about which almost every Catholic and many non-Catholics have a lot to say. So tonight, we have assembled a trio of panelists with their moderator who have been involved in many serious conferences and conversations about the focus of tonight's roundtable, Priests for the 21st Century, Revisioning Priesthood for a New Day. Let me first begin by welcoming our roundtable moderator, Diane Vella, a member of the Spirit Alive Advisory Board. For over 40 years, she has served as a lay ecclesial minister on Long Island and is now in her 16th year of service as pastoral associate at St. Bernard's Parish, Levittown, where she oversees several parish programs, including RCIA for youths and adults, as well as consolation ministries. Thank you, Diane, for moderating this panel. Next, we welcome Dr. Zini Fox, an internationally recognized theologian and expert on lay ecclesial ministry. Many of you joining tonight may have heard Zini in person or read some of her countless publications focused on raising up the laity, lay ecclesial ministry, and the spirituality of lay leaders. Glad you could be here tonight, Zini.
Thank you, Maria.
Our next guest, Dr. Thomas Groom, is an internationally renowned theologian. We only get internationally recognized theologians here, and a popular Catholic author and authority on religious education. Anyone who has been involved in religious education has clearly benefited from his expertise and his wisdom. From 2015 to 2018, Tom was the director of the Church in the 21st Century Center at Boston College, where he devoted his energies to the center's mission to be a catalyst and resource for renewal in the Catholic Church. Currently, Tom is professor of theology and religious education at Boston College, and his latest book, What Makes Education Catholic, is a response to probably the $64,000 question that nobody has been able to answer. The rest of the title is Spiritual Foundation. It was published by Orbis in 2021, and that book adds to his very extensive list of books and articles. Thanks, Tom, for making time to be with us. And finally, we welcome Franciscan Father John Stowe, OFM Conventual, current Bishop of Lexington, Kentucky, one of the poorest dioceses in the United States of America. He is also the Bishop President of Pax Christi USA, selected for his lifelong commitment to peacemaking and racial and social justice. Bishop John is an ardent supporter of immigrant rights and immigration reform. He is among the youngest members of the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops and one of the strongest voices arguing in support of protecting the basic rights of all persons, including members of the LGBT community. We are glad to have you here this evening. So our panelists welcome all of your questions and your comments. I ask you to put them in the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we can tonight. So Diane, it's all yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maria. It's just a pleasure to be here and to be in the company of these very esteemed panelists. And so let's get right down to it here, to these questions. First of all, I'd like to just start off by giving just a little bit of a background as to the inspiration of the topic of this roundtable. It all came out of a seminar that was held at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, I believe in 2019, where the questions about the future of priesthood in the 21st century were raised and discussed. And that seminar ended up being culminating in the publication of a document that was called To Serve the People of God, which laid out these questions and a vision of the priesthood for the 21st century. From that document, a conference was held at Boston College in which many people participated. Bishops, including 4 cardinals, were there. There were theologians, seminary professors, lay ecclesial ministers, all to raise questions about the priesthood in the 21st century. The conference ended up putting out a communique which made some recommendations, and that communique, as well as the whole process, was put together in a book by Orbis Press on the future of priestly ministry. So some of these panelists here were a part of this project, or Tom just happens to have a copy of the book. And really, the questions that were raised there are the questions, as Maria said, that the Church in the United States is asking about priesthood at this time. And so really the overarching question that we'd like to ask these panelists tonight is basically, what are their observations? What are their visions? What are their insights and their hopes about the future of priesthood in the 21st century? And I'd like to start by asking Tom, we have heard from Pope Francis any number of times that he laments what he calls the curse of clericalism that seems to have befallen the priesthood, not only in the United States, but obviously in other places as well. What is it, Tom, that you understand Pope Francis to mean by this curse of clericalism?
Great. Well, thank you, Diane, and hello to the Bishop and to Zini. I'm delighted to be with you all. Privileged indeed. And what an important conversation this is. In some ways, I see this as a life and death issue for our beloved Catholic faith. We've got to solve the problem of priesthood. It's choking us to death in its present forms. So there's an urgency, an emergency, an exigency here, the like of which the Church hasn't experienced, I think, since, I don't know, maybe the Protestant Reformation or even sooner, before then. What does he mean by clericalism? I mean, it's the opposite of what Jesus told his disciples. At least 6 different times, the scholars say, Jesus told them, warned them, don't lord it over people. Don't lord it over people. And yet that's what we've set our priests up to do, to lord it over people. And we fool the poor men. And for now, at least, they're all men in our communion. We fool them into thinking that they can, that they're entitled to lord it over people because they're ordained. Now, as you know, Diane, I think everything goes back, all the problems, all the solutions go back to a good or bad catechesis. So let me hold forth for a moment on the catechesis. When you go to the early church, the catechumens, the Cyril of Jerusalem is addressing the catechumens. He said to them, you're all alter Christi, you're all other Christs. And that language continued until the Reformation, that every Christian was an alter Christus, was another Christ. But then the Reformation came along. Now, in its historical context, it was somewhat ununderstandable. The holy orders had been denied as a sacrament. So the reformers were obviously dismantling the whole hierarchical structure and sacerdotal nature of priesthood and all the rest of it. So, but what happened then was the more the reformers downplayed ordained ministry, the more Catholics upplayed it. And so, for example, that language of being an alter Christus became reserved unto the priest alone. The priest was another Christ. But for 1,500 years, all the baptized were other Christs. And then, as I said, in its historical context, I mean, the reformers had denied the sacrament and the Eucharist and so on. But we overreacted. And I'm going to read a little bit from the Catechism of the Council of Trent. Now, the Catechism of the Council of Trent, I would propose, is one of the most influential books in the history of the Church over its 2,000 years, because you see, the decrees of Trent weren't even translated into English for about 250 years. But the Catechism of Trent is what proclaimed the faith and the teachings of that great council. And in many old cultures, the Catechism of the Council of Trent was taken and subdivided into a 3-year cycle of preaching, that the priest was to take the Catechism of Trent, sometimes called the Roman Catechism, and craft his sermon around it for a 3-year cycle. And this was how people got catechized in their faith. As I said, it's the most influential book, I think, in the history of our church, the Catechism of Trent. Now, in the Catechism of Trent, let me read from you. When it came to holy orders, this is the opening line, and it's an opening paragraph or so. It says, bishops and priests are God's interpreters and ambassadors, empowered in his name to teach humankind, I'll change the language a little, to teach humankind the divine law and the rules of conduct. And they hold the place of God on earth. And so it is evident that no nobler function than theirs can even be imagined. Justly are our priests called not only angels, but even gods.
Wow.
Now, it's a small g, to be fair, but even called gods, because they exercise in our midst the power and the prerogative of the Almighty God.
Wow.
Now, that was getting, so no wonder we've got a legacy of clericalism, people with inflated opinions of themselves and understandings of their functions. And not only that, but I mean, and you can't blame the priest, because the people began to expect this of their priests. And then we can get into our different cultures and the response and so on to the various events of history and so on. But I think we've got a huge job and task and challenge to undo this clericalism legacy and resituate priesthood where it belongs, at the heart and center of the Christian community, not pontificating over it or lording it over it, as Jesus would say, but being at the service of and facilitating the holiness of all of God's people.
Wow.
Because we're all alter Christi.
Thank you, Tom. So yeah, this curse of clericalism that has come down to us over the centuries seems to have put priests in the minds of the people, and perhaps in their own minds, kind of in a separate species of discipleship.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Zini, how would you see that the priesthood needs to be better situated within the community of believers, rather than being seen as this exalted separate species of discipleship?
In terms of the formation of priests in the seminary, I see 2 points that would be particularly important. And one would be the intellectual formation, and the other would be the pastoral formation that the men have. I think intellectually, the theology of Vatican II takes us to the new place beyond, as Tom so well put it, what the legacy from Trent. And it really emphasizes that the church is, first of all, the people of God, the whole people. And when the documents were being developed, originally the order in the Constitution on the Church placed priesthood first, but it was then reordered to place first the people of God, the whole people of God. And it was in that context that we understand priesthood, within the context of the community that the priest serves, that the priest animates in many ways. So that primary teaching, Constitution on the Church, then we have the decree on the apostolate of the laity, emphasizing the role of the laity, the whole congregation, but also within the laity, those who have particular roles. And that's an area that I think is still not sufficiently developed in our understanding. But if intellectual formation of men for priesthood had these points of emphasis, it would make a big difference in their understanding. The mind is not the first thing that changes. It has to be the whole culture. But nonetheless, as a theologian, I do place some weight in the the role of the mind. So looking at a curriculum for a seminary, what is included? Is the whole focus of the curriculum the priesthood, or does it include the community, the other ministers that are part of the church? What is the way the priesthood is taught? Is it high emphasis on the sacral dimensions, or does it include the communal, the being the animator of the community, being part of the community? I grew up in a Polish parish, and I really think those years ago that was a much more visible dimension of the life of the church. Our priests visited the homes of all of the people twice a year, once a short visit before Easter to bless the Easter food, but once around Epiphany, a prolonged visit in each room, and to sit with the people and talk with the people. They were more present to the life of the people than what I observed today. So I think that presence, that intellectual formation shaping it, this is very much emphasized in today's church by Francis, which was already referenced in terms of his calling upon priests to walk with the people. But Benedict already had emphasized that. This is a favorite quote of mine from Benedict. It was an address he gave to the pastoral leaders of the Diocese of Rome. And he said, laypersons must no longer be viewed as collaborators of the clergy, but truly be recognized as co-responsible for the church's being and action. That's a sentiment, I think, that our bishops' document on lay ecclesial ministers, co-workers in the vineyard of the Lord, captures. And I said I'd comment intellectual formation, but also pastoral formation. 2 points here. The recent Roman document on seminaries emphasizes throughout that the role of the laity in the formation of priests is important. And I'm going to share one example of the way this is being addressed. St. Mary's in Cleveland has one of those wonderful Lilly grants. I think it's $5 million in order to work for the next 5 years on a focus on field education, and how when the men go into parishes, they will be formed through the pastoral education that they're involved in, the field education. The plan that Father Andy Turner has developed for this project is that when the men go in, and by the way, it includes lay ecclesial ministers who might be being formed at the seminary as well, but when they go into a parish, that they will work with the pastor and the lay ecclesial ministers, and those people will be trained in a partnership model so that the working together will be evidenced in their lives, and then the seminarian brought into that. So the seminarian would work with the pastor, with each lay ecclesial ministers in the ministries of which they're involved. This partnership model of placing seminarians within the community of other ministers, within the community of the people of the parish, I think would be very significant in developing this. And one final point about this project, that there are numbers of groups that are involved in the design and the oversight of this project. One of them, the National Association for Lay Ministry, which I think is significant. CATFI, the field education organization for Catholics, Catholic Theological Union, and Aquinas Institute. So a mix of formal partners, but then there are additional seminaries that are being invited in select ways to be part of this effort. The goal of the project to identify best practices and develop resources that can be used by other seminaries in order to involve lay people in the formation of the seminarians.
So with formation being a key thing here in terms of addressing this problem of clericalism in the priesthood, Bishop John, as someone who is responsible for the formation of priests in your diocese, If you were to describe for us what you would see as a well-formed priest for the 21st century, what would be the characteristics that you would see or that you would think would be important for a well-formed priest?
Well, thank you for the question, Diane. And that well-formed priest certainly wouldn't be a god and probably not even an angel, according to the Council of Trent description. But the well-formed priest, I think today, has to be well-educated, but not educated enough to know that he's not the most educated person in the parish and to work well with educated people. Has to be a person of prayer, especially when not leading others in prayer. So not only when at the altar or administering the sacrament, but outside of those formal prayer times. A well-formed priest has to be sensitive to a variety of cultures that make up the church today. And that would include an awareness of the gifts and strengths of their own culture, but also the prejudices that come with that culture and the weaknesses of that culture. The well-formed priest today has to be able to work with women, has to work with women as collaborators and as equals, and should be able to take direction from women. A well-formed priest today has to be sensitive to the excluded. It's very easy to minister to those who are always there and always affirming your ministry. Priests get lots of affirmation from those who are in the pews, but there's a lot who aren't there. We have to be sensitive to the excluded. It's necessary, perhaps not ideal, but necessary that the priest be a competent manager today. But a competent manager is also able to delegate, not a micromanager, but a manager who can empower and who can lead. For a priest to be a good leader, that priest also has to know how to be a companion and also able to follow when necessary. But a leader who can also accompany, and a competent leader brings people along, doesn't just march off on their own or insist that people march along. The well-formed priest today has to be at least bilingual. That's countercultural in itself, but should really be multilingual. And I would add, Latin is not the most useful language in the ministry today. And the priest has to be a lifelong learner. The priest has to be somebody who continues to learn about the faith, learn about the promptings of God's Spirit, learn the art of discernment. Pope Francis speaks so much about discernment, and I'm afraid our seminaries aren't necessarily teaching discernment after one's ordained. Discernment to find one's vocation, yes, but lifelong discernment. And to be a lifelong learner, one has to be a good listener. And that's vital for the priesthood as well. I'm not sure who would measure up to those categories, but those are the things that I'm looking for and will help our seminarians to measure up to more and more.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've spoken, Bishop John, about collaboration. You've spoken about effectiveness in preaching. You've spoken about pastoral attitudes, being able to work with women, with lay people. How do all of you respond to Bishop John's description of the well-formed priest in the 21st century?
Well, I love it. It's a wonderful, wonderful description. But are our seminaries willing, able, open, committed to that kind of formation? I don't know how many major seminaries we have now in this country. Bishop John probably knows. I think it's mid-30s, 35, 36 major seminaries. And many of them continue to be havens, little havens of clericalism and closed away from the world and so on. And I can give examples of a seminary who forbids their students from coming and taking courses, for example, at a great theologate just up the road from them at Boston College. So that openness, even that intellectual openness, and as well as spiritual and pastoral, etc., I don't know that it's present in the typical seminaries. Now, there's some very fine seminaries in our country, but many of them are still following a very traditional model. They take in young men or middle-aged men now, or older men now, but immediately they dress them up as priests and put collars on them and black, berettas and all the rest of it, and send them out looking like priests and getting nodded at and saluted, and it goes to their head. It's not a good way to prepare them. So I love the description that Bishop John and that Zini lays out. It's a big challenge right now.
I think that's true, but I also think that there are currents that are trying to bring about change. I gradually have learned, and I mean really gradually learned, in the School of Hard Knocks, that it's extremely difficult to change structures. It's extremely difficult to change a culture, and that there are places where new growth will come more quickly and others where things will retrench. The seminary that I served in 82 or 72, oh, goodness mind. But it was one of the first in the country to admit lay students to the degree program. And it had a reputation as being extremely welcoming of integrating the students, lay and clerical, together very well through liturgies and social activities. And over the course of time, that significantly changed, that it moved into a much more clerical model. And I think those things are very difficult. It's very difficult to bring that change. And I have taken as a practice in recent years trying to pay attention to the good, or what I see as the good, because I believe that's where God is working. And so right now I'm looking at what's happening in Syria in terms of all of the aid that is flowing there and the way people are trying to help in this drastically difficult situation. And the same way with the seminaries. I'm taking great hope in what Father Andy is trying to do. I was part of a 2-day program when they did some of the design of how this would go forward. And the people that he gathered from a couple of other seminaries, there are people who really want to bring about change. And so that gives me hope. But it's going to be a while. So I won't see it.
Bishop John, are you aware of any conversation or meaningful movement in this area from your brother bishops, from seminary rectors throughout the country? What Zini just described for us is something that's very hopeful, a very hopeful model. But are you aware of bishops and seminary rectors looking at these issues with any seriousness, and any emerging models of priestly formation and ministry that are being tried anywhere?
Sure. And first, what I want to say to Zini is you pointed out that decades ago, some of these things were happening and there's been a retrenchment. And that's really sad, because I was the fruit of seminary preparation that involved laity, that involved women, that was very forward looking. It was in an ecumenical context. But there are fewer and fewer places where that happens. And I also want to say that it's not just the official seminary that's forming priests, but now we have this phenomenon of an underground seminary from Twitter and from the blogs of very Tridentine priests that are creating a whole different environment that undermines what's going on in the seminaries. And all of the seminary faculty will tell you about the formation that goes on outside of their own structures.
Wow.
But you asked for positive, and yes, that happens. Some of my seminarians are studying at Sacred Heart School of Theology and Ministry at Hales Corners, Wisconsin, where Father Raul Gomez is the rector, and they have made it one of the things that they want to distinguish them as a seminary is employing fully the magisterium of Pope Francis. And though they host an informal gathering of bishops every year together with the papal nuncio to talk about the qualities needed in priests and how that should influence their academics, how that should influence their pastoral formation, put a heavy emphasis on human formation. You know, we have to have well-developed, mature priests that have dealt with their own sexuality and are able to live the life that they are promising to live healthily. Frankly, I see it more common in religious seminaries and religious formation programs than in diocesan seminaries.
Yes.
I'm privileged to serve on the board of the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, and the interaction of women faculty, the availability of ecumenical courses, as many of our seminaries have, but it's fully integrated in the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, where it's very easy to take a course at another seminary, where they share a common library with other denominations, and where women make up a good percentage of the student body. The college seminary that our seminarians go to from Lexington is in Indianapolis, where they go to Marian University. And so they have to leave the seminary setting for their classes, and they even take their meals over there with other students. So there's a semblance of engaging in humanity, and that's a diocesan operation. So that's a positive one. CTU, with its model of emphasis on missiology, as well as the international community that it's formed there. There are some very healthy places to form priests. I don't know how many dioceses have access to those places.
Yeah.
Well, there is some hope there, and some good news to hear.
Diane,
Sure.
could I interrupt and I just
Sure.
want to put in a good word for Boston College, and because what Bishop Stowe is describing is identical to what we have at our School of Theology and Ministry. We have over 400 students. About 100 of them are seminarians, Jesuits, Franciscans, a number of different orders, and then about 300 lay people. And they're all mixed in together. We had a spectacular liturgy there today that would knock your socks off. And the music, the quality of participation and prayer is just tremendous. And so, and that's, I think, where the human formation that Bishop Stowe was talking about can most readily take place. Good, healthy environment. Now the spiritual formation and the intellectual formation and the pastoral formation are all imperative, but as the bishop said, the human formation is probably the most crucial and the one that we've done least well probably over the years, and especially if you take young people or any age and lock them up in a clerical environment, and I think that's when the human formation suffers. Anyway, I just want to put in that little plug for our STM.
Well, a theme that keeps coming up here is the interaction, the healthy interaction of priests, seminarians in formation with other people, with lay people, particularly with women, who make up, by the way, the bulk of professional ministers in the church at this point. I was just looking at some statistics from the Center for the Applied Research in the Apostolate, Georgetown University. In 2021, there were 34,900 priests in the United States. That's lay and religious together, and diocesan and religious together, and 44,500 lay ecclesial ministers working in parishes. That's 10,000 more lay ecclesial ministers than priests. So Zini, as someone who has done a lot of research and writing and speaking in the area of professional lay ecclesial ministry, how would you see priestly ministry fitting into the overall picture of ministry in the church, particularly professional lay ministry, but also ministry in general?
Again, I would look at from a perspective theologically and what we can draw from there. And if we have the image of the church as, first of all, the people, the community, the whole people walking together, and the priest within that, it shifts from the priest above, the priest as, heaven help us, I'd never heard that one, as almost God, but it changes the perspective. And when we look at the community, there's so much in the teachings from Vatican II and the teachings since then on the fact that within that community, there are multiple roles and they're held by multiple people. And to uphold this kind of a vision in terms of priesthood and in terms of the body of the church. And there's so many historical perspectives that can help to underline that. I remember when I first became fascinated with how many ministries were present in the earliest church communities, and that we lost sight of that there were teachers, the capital T, as who were the ministers. There were prophets with a capital P who were ministers. There were house church leaders. There were other individuals and ministries that were part of the lived life of the church at that time. And the fact that we have gradually seen only the apostles as being central, that's a loss. It's a loss in terms of teaching at the professional level, but also the understanding of the people. Tom referred to something earlier that I quite agree with, that the issue is not only the priest's sense of himself, but the community's sense of the priest and the putting the priest on a pedestal. And when I worked in the parish 100 years ago, the first DRE in the Diocese of Bridgeport, people would sometimes say, oh, I couldn't say that to Father. Well, there's something wrong with that perception, that being able to speak of problems, and they weren't talking about personal problems, but parish problems, parish issues. So I think that this sense of helping people understand that there was a role for so many in our earliest church story that can be helpful. The great favorite book of mine has always been that of Thomas O'Mara, in which he traces through history the different forms of ministry that came forward in different periods and wonderfully links them with the cultural realities of the time. And that, again, this emphasis on many ministries. But there is a line, and I couldn't find it, I tried very hard, but there is a line in his book in which he says that gradually all of the ministries were swallowed by the clerical ministries.
Yes.
And that this is something that, again, it's a whole rethinking, reimagining, that's the better phrase, reimagining on the part of the people and those who were teaching seminarians and teaching lay students. Someone spoke about lay ecclesial ministers becoming clerical, and I really bridled at that. I don't quite know how that would happen. It might in years ahead, but I certainly don't see it in the present diminished place that they are in terms of the church. That's just one of my pet things over here. But provocative quote for me from O'Mara: charism and ministry assumed certain forms, not simply out of obedience to the biblical letter, but also because society itself called or even forced the church toward patterns that seemed attractive and useful. One of the thoughts I've had is that we are living in a society where professionals in general have other professionals who work with them who are not the same kind exactly that they are. Doctors have, nurse practitioners have different, and in law, in so many places, there are different roles that are being filled. And that's what's happened in this country in ministry. The tremendous emergence of lay people in the course of since it began 1975. And Diane, there's a deeper statistic from the one that you shared. In 2020, the number of lay people in parish ministry surpassed the number of priests in parish ministry. Because you see, when we have the general count, it almost doubles the number of priests, plus it includes all of those in specialized ministries. But at the level of the parish, it's the lay people.
Yeah.
I was on a Zoom earlier today, and someone from a diocesan staff said that the bishop has said what carried us through the pandemic were the lay people in the parishes and the diocese who held roles as lay ecclesial ministers. But that is not grasped enough. So, so that principle, the priestly ministry, is one among many. I think that that will be something that would help, and certainly recent developments are pointing us there. In 1972, when Paul VI said there will be lay ministries of lector and acolyte, which of course never really went anywhere in this country because they had to be men. But now Pope Francis is installing catechists in an official ministry of the church. And we don't know what we're going to do with that yet in the United States. I serve on a task force that's saying, how does that fit here? It's so far difficult to think about. But this whole question that has emerged theologically about the ordering of ministries, there are some of those points addressed in the book that Diane referenced and Tom held up for us, of there's something new that has happened and we haven't figured out yet what to do with it all. But I think it follows what O'Meara pointed toward. The society has changed. The roles of multiple people in each professional area of work in the society, the roles of women and the push on that. So, so I think there is this rethinking that will go forward as we look at some really tragedies that are happening in terms of parishes that are being closed because there aren't enough priests, priests who are wearing so many hats that they're literally being burned out. The rethinking that has to happen in terms of what has emerged, but we haven't theologically and structurally worked through yet. So.
Tom, you wanted to respond? I see you jumping up and down there.
Well, no, Jeannie makes some wonderful points. Raymond Brown counted 12 ministries in the early Christian communities that then gradually got subsumed into diakoni, episcopoi, and sacerdos, and our presbyteroi, and the hierarchicalizing then of those really was much more the model of the empire than of the Gospels, because the social model that was available to organize ourselves was the empire. And so you got the emperor and all the levels of command down along, et cetera, et cetera. So but as you well said, that's not necessary. No, and it's interesting, the old word hierarchy actually meant to get people to work well together. It meant holy order. The sacrament is still well named. They're in charge of holy order, but it doesn't mean hierarchy is the opposite of anarchy. But hierarchy was to get people to work well together, and that was the role of the ordained person, not to pontificate or to hand down proclamations or directions or whatever, but to enable the gifts of the community to function well together. And I think that'll always be the function and role of the priest. Now, how to train people for that is the challenge that we have writ large in our time. But you know, formation that has to include the human is so imperative for our future priests going forward. Yeah, let me leave it at that for now, Diane.
You know, formation. We've talked a lot about formation, and that's kind of one end of the puzzle here. Then priests are ordained. And then we have an issue of ongoing formation, accountability. You know, you mentioned professionalism, Zini. You know, in most professions, there is built-in accountability. There is expectation for ongoing formation. By and large, we do not have that for the priesthood in the United States. So I'm wondering what really any of you would have to say about that. Maybe I'll go to Bishop John for that one, since once again, as an overseer of the priests, what are your thoughts about the issue of accountability and ongoing formation?
Well, I think they're two different issues, very much related. Rome has given lots of documents about the importance of ongoing formation. The U.S. bishops have endorse the importance of ongoing formation. But when it comes to accountability, priests are among the least accountable people anywhere, because they know they're needed. Number one, they know that they have a lot of leverage when they're dealing with the bishop, because the bishop can't afford to let them go or to remove their faculties or whatever kind of disciplinary measures would be needed. That's why when I earlier was describing the well-formed priest, it was a lifelong learner, because anybody that's been in a parish that's had the same priest for a couple lectionary cycles has probably heard everything that priest has to say, unless they're constantly reading and constantly engaged in new studies, new insights, engaged in the life of people. I'm pleased with the opportunities that we've been able to give the priests in my diocese, for example, for ongoing formation, but holding them accountable. I really work to keep the whole presbyterate involved in that, to help them hold each other accountable. And we do provide some kind of evaluation that engages the laity in just giving them feedback. It doesn't have to be destructive. It can be constructive and even critical, but it is important that it's about respect for the work. If you're never evaluated, it means you're not all that important. And for a role that's as important as the priest, it's really unfortunate. And what I'm saying about priests could go for bishop as well. So, sometimes I like to joke that my boss is in Rome, so it's pretty hard to be accountable.
Well, thank you for that. I think it's time, and I believe there are already some questions in the chat about this, but the elephants that are in the room here.
Yes.
I'd like to throw out to all of you, maybe starting with Tom, what implications would you see in this new vision for priestly ministry in the 21st century? What implications would you see for the controversial questions of the current limitation in the Catholic Church of priesthood to celibate men? So maybe you could start off, and then we could have a little conversation about that.
And have a talk about the elephant. That's a program of study we did at Boston College, a 3-year program, and we engaged some of the leading theologians of our time. We had a 12-person faculty seminar that met for 2 years, 4 times a semester, an hour and a half each meeting, countless hours. We consulted other theologians around the world. We had those major gatherings at Boston College. We had historians, people who went back into priesthood in the early Christian communities, and how do we begin to inherit a priesthood, and the influence of the Hebrew and Jewish tradition, etc. But at the end of the day, we came back down to some very simple conclusions that are watertight and that we could defend, and that are definitely of God and of God's revelation to us. And one is to resituate priesthood in the midst of the faith community, and rather than up over it or apart from it or directing it, but to be a catalyst in the midst of the faith community, located in the faith community. And then there's only 3 essential functions that we could come up with and agree with. And you've said them already, Diane, in passing: to pastor, to preach, and to preside. To pastor in a way that takes the gifts of all the community and facilitates them and enables them and empowers them to work well together. Again, the definition of holy order is to work well together. And so let them go back to enabling people to work well together and to facilitating, to be a good pastor, and especially in the works of compassion and justice to those in need. So to be a good pastor that takes and encourages and enlivens and facilitates the gifts of the whole community to work well together, that's their pastoral role. The preaching is one that we've returned to, thank goodness, and that is to break open the Word of God in meaningful ways for people's lives. And they have to be prepared well to do that and practice well to do that, and they should get their sermons well prepared to do that, etc., etc. The responsibility to preach effectively, and then, of course, to preside prayerfully, joy with the community and our celebrations and our shared prayer, our shared worship, our celebration of the sacraments, and in particular the celebration of the sacred Eucharist. So, but that pastoring, preaching, and presiding is all we ask of them, and that is ultimately what is needed within a resituated, in the midst of, rather than up over the people of God. And when we stopped and looked at it, we had to conclude that there is nothing about the functions and the forms of priesthood that require celibacy or that require maleness. We can no longer theologically claim that maleness is a requisite for priesthood. Well, for the first 1200 years, when, of course, our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters have kept up a married priesthood. So they obviously, and given, and I don't want to go into this but given the horrendous scandals that we've been through and all the rest of it, I don't see any other way for us out into a new day other than by making it optional. Now, we'd always cherished the vowed religious life of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And if somebody wants to be a good Franciscan like Bishop John, or a Jesuit like my brother, like my friends at Boston College, blessings, praise God. But to require that for the sake of priesthood is dreadfully dysfunctional at this point in time. And likewise, the maleness. There is no evidence, there's no theological warranted argument left that because Jesus ordained only men, which, equating priesthood today with the 12 apostles then is false. No scripture scholar would do that. And that they had to look like Jesus, the iconic argument, ridiculous. It's almost embarrassing. Some of the arguments we make for this, if you push them to their logical conclusions, you must be male in order to fulfill this function. It's ridiculous. There's no good theological warrant for it. So that I think opening priesthood to, as I said, always cherishing the vowed religious life, but opening priesthood to married people, and especially in parts of the world where they're desperately needed. Where I didn't spend much time in South America, but I've gone in and out of there a few times. But the stories you hear about people who get to have Eucharist once a year because the priest can't get through there. I mean, why not take some of the very probatus, virus probatus from that community and give them 6 months of intensive training or preparation or a year or whatever and ordain them to serve that community? We are so irresponsible at this point in time in how we are doing and exercising priesthood. Irresponsible to the faith, irresponsible to the gospel. And so, and as I said, we argued about this in that seminar at length. And at the end of the day, there was no argument left to maintaining the present status quo by way of limiting it exclusively to men and to celibates. Can't be warranted theologically. When the Holy Spirit of the Church gets around, I don't know.
Bishop John, response to that?
Well, I'm not going to argue theologically with Tom. I think he's on the right track for the most part. But I also like the larger discussion here about not collapsing all ministry into priesthood. Yeah. And there are other ways to answer this question. In my diocese, we have parish life directors who are lay people. We had a husband and wife team as a parish life directors in one place. We have women that are parish life directors, both religious women and lay women. And they do those roles. They can't preside at Eucharist, but they do preach to the community. They do animate the community. They are the living presence of the community. And in fact, because for many, the priesthood has become so cultic and so sacrament only focused that in a part of the world like Appalachia, where many of my parishes are, I can assign a priest to a parish, and there's so few Catholics in that community. He's sitting there twiddling his thumbs, and I assign a parish life director to that community, and there's not enough hours in the day for her to do everything that needs to be done because there's such a broader approach to ministry. Mm-hmm. Then I think about, Pope Francis, opening, as Zini mentioned before, the ministry of catechist, the ministry of acolyte and lector. The U.S. bishops have not touched that, and there's no reason why we couldn't start with acolyte and lector, even though they're functioning in those roles without having the installation in those roles, but it would be a step forward. We have somebody like Phyllis Agano working so hard on the historical background of the women in the diaconate, ordained deacons who are women in the early church, and studies going on there. We've also had Pope Francis separate some aspects of authority from ordination, which is another key thing and has to do with canon law. So in religious life, like for my community, for men, brothers can now be superiors. That was not possible before Pope Francis, if it was a mixed community of priests and brothers. To place women in higher levels in the curia, he's trying to broaden the sense of ministry and not only avoid the question of women, but also broaden the sense of ministry.
Maria, can we give Zini a word on that one before we go to the questions?
Yeah, we have a bunch of questions and comments, so
Okay.
if we can move quickly over to them, because I want people to have their opportunity to question.
Okay.
Well,
Let's
the
see.
part that I've particularly focused in my work has been on the lay ecclesial ministers and seeing them as something that we have not yet learned well how to function with. I'm aware, this very briefly, I'm aware that many parish ministers lost their positions during the pandemic. I'm also aware that there are parishes that applied for money through the government and were able to keep their parish staffs. And those parishes thrived better because there were so many things that were able to be done. My own parish offered live streaming, and they said without the two young adults who set that up and got that going, they wouldn't have been able to do it. They were not official roles at the parish, but they were lay people who used their gifts and talents for the working of the church, which I think is what we're talking about. So, okay.
So Diane, you want to?
Sure,
in the
sure.
chat
We have a
box here.
question for Bishop Stowe regarding the Synod on Synodality. With the Synod on Synodality, priests are meant to learn to listen and discern with their portion of the people of God in a co-responsible way. This person says, my experience in my own communities, campus ministry and related parish, the opening stage of the synod was either ignored or the priests excused themselves from the listening sessions so that people would speak freely. How are we to hope that our current priests will be able to adapt and grow in true synodality?
Yeah, I hope the answer to that question is that this is not going to go away. I'm afraid some of the priests think this is a fad or this is a program that we're going to work through. But I think Pope Francis is clear that this has got to be the way of being church going forward. So I would agree with the questioner, because I was in a synod. We're in the continental phase of the synod now, and we had a Zoom session specifically for priests on on this portion of the synod yesterday. And it was, I'm sorry to say, the worst session that I've been to so far, because the priests were trying to limit what the synod could do, and they were always trying to put constraints on it rather than follow where the Spirit is leading. And the comment was made in many places that the priests were absent from the process and the bishops were absent from the process. On the other hand, today we had an ecumenical portion, so we had clergy from a variety of denominations, and it was a very fruitful and rich dialogue. And one of the things that struck me was having ordained women as part of the group that I was working with. And they talked about how the mere ordination of women doesn't get rid of misogyny or raise women to equal status within the church. And so they were saying, just don't think that's the only answer, that you still have to overcome all kinds of injustice, all kinds of difficulties. But I think the answer to the question is that this process is not going to go away. So they need to get on board, but it has borne more fruit with the laity.
Speaking of injustice, we had a question here, and whoever wants to field it. When is the church going to accept that some of its finest priest servants are gay?
Sorry, the question is to accept the fact that they are gay?
When is the church going to accept that some of its finest priest servants are gay?
So Father Brian Massengale talks about that, and he describes it as the open closet problem. That what everybody knows and nobody's willing to acknowledge in any formal way, or we have the hidden homophobic tendencies from those who are covering up themselves or in a difficult situation that's just so unhealthy. So again, going back to the description of what the well-formed priest looks like, is one who's adult and in their psychosexual formation as a human being and able to relate to people of both sexes. And while the rule of celibacy is in place, that they are healthily able to live that celibacy. I don't know if we can say when it's going to happen, but it is something that not too many people are fooled about.
There's a question for
I always
Tom.
think,
Sorry,
so
go
just
ahead,
quick,
Tom.
one quick word. I mean, if the people are saying now, the sociologists, psychologists, that it may be as high as 20%, maybe even higher in our society of people who are in varied places on the sexual identity spectrum. And so this could be a quarter of God's people. And now my fear is that if 20% of our society of people are of varied sexual orientations, LGBTQ, then 20% of priesthood should be likewise. The difficulty becomes, and this is sometimes talked about, if it goes to 50 or 60 or 70%, then it's a different issue. Because, and it's very often, I know I have gay friends who have entered seminary because they said, well, I can't be sexually active or as a gay man. And so, and there were also people of good, deep Christian faith. And in many ways, they chose it. Now, I'm not defending that or explaining that or anything else, but in a sense, it was one of their ways of dealing with their sexuality was to take a promise or a vow of celibacy. And I don't think that's, if we begin to have a disproportionate number of people in priesthood, I think the average, the normal average should be present. But if it exceeds that significantly, then I think something else is going on.
There was a question, again, maybe to Bishop Stowe, who oversees the education and formation of our seminaries? Is it the bishop, the seminary rector? Can Pope Francis dictate certain norms for all seminaries in order to be in conformity with the idea of a well-formed priest?
Yes, but by the time those things are put on such a global level, so much depends on how it's interpreted and how it's carried out on the day-to-day operations of a seminary. So the bishop is responsible for the seminarians of his diocese. In many cases, most dioceses don't have their own seminaries, so there are seminaries that have multiple dioceses, and some rectors are beholden to multiple bishops. And so they have a variety of spectrums in terms of the ecclesiology of those bishops and try to please everybody. So that's a difficult challenge. But because the question included that part about whether the Pope could do something, the more progressive version of seminary that Zini was describing much earlier tonight, that happened decades ago, that came to an end because of a Vatican investigation of seminaries.
Right.
I was at a place where there was a woman who had a major role in the formation of seminaries, and she had to be listed there as the librarian because they wouldn't accept her in the role that she was actually performing. Well, how ridiculous, but that's how we got away with it in one place. But much more progressive things were happening before that. What they call the Vatican SWAT team came in and reoriented seminaries and put in stricter rules about separation and all the things that went backwards. So I would like to see another SWAT team come in with the vision of Pope Francis.
Good.
Because I think that's what it would take.
That'd be wonderful.
There was actually another question about that crackdown on the seminaries. It was from apparently Hi Tom from Paul Boudreau. He asked what role you thought that the 1984 crackdown on American seminaries played in the current formation of our priests. So you've Bishop Stowe has addressed that a little bit.
Jumped on your question, Tom. Sorry.
No, Bishop, no, you did it wonderfully well. And yeah, that was a fine response. And I think maybe Francis will, you know, anyway, maybe he will do what the bishop is saying. He's certainly of like sentiment.
I think the other piece is that a lot of change comes from the bottom up, and that these seminaries that have worked through ways of having men and women study together, people preparing for diocesan priesthood, religious life, and lay ecclesial ministry such as CTU. I think there are examples that are very helpful. Aquinas Institute. I've always held this little story. The head of the Association of Theological Schools one year announced to the membership that for the first time we've reached equity on a faculty of men and women. And he paused, and then he said, and it's a Catholic seminary. So the changes ferment, and Aquinas is, they say Dominicans come in two kinds, and therefore we have worked out models for doing this. And I think that the models need to be held up so others see them. I'll be very interested to see what happens as a result of St. Mary's in Cleveland. By the way, that project director who designed the study was director of field education. He has just been named director by his bishop. So that will be another way that this will be shared in seminary circles, and that we can feel positively about. So.
Thank you. Does anyone, I think we're probably coming, Maria, to the close of our time together. Would anyone like to have a final word in terms of hopes and visions for the priesthood for the 21st century?
Diane, before
Sure.
they do, one
Sure.
question I think a lot of people would have is, why do we continue to import priests who have no facility with American culture? It's typical of the parish to say, who's saying Mass on Sunday? If it's the guy from Poland or Africa, nobody wants to go to church. They don't want their sacraments administered necessarily this way. So, I mean, how problematic is that in the church, that we are not using the people in our own world and our own culture that can speak to our culture and society, and ordaining them or empowering them to do this work, and we're importing people? How long are we going to do that before the balance is tipped and people are just going to walk out the door and say, I don't understand him, he doesn't understand me, so let's forget this?
This is a dangerous question for me to respond to, because that's how I first came to this country. Ordained for the diocese of Dodge City, Kansas, a kid from the middle of the bogs of Ireland. But at least we had some version of the language. Now we were a bit of a brogue, but nonetheless we spoke the language. We did some research, that group at Boston College, into this, and that research center in Washington was very helpful to us as well. It hasn't worked well, and generally speaking, and also we're very often taking men out of context where they're needed. Where they're needed worse than even in our country, but they can come here, and the salary they can make will maintain their family back in Africa or wherever it is. And but meanwhile, you're right, Maria, that the heavy accent and so on, and not speaking the language readily and not being able to be understood, it's not working. And I don't think it's how to solve the priest shortage to import.
That's an area that's been of great concern of mine, and I fault the leadership, the bishops in general, that enculturation is not addressed in a serious way. That would make a big difference.
Yeah, they're not prepared.
I once served on the Association of Theological Schools visitation committee for Orchard Lake Seminary, which is Polish oriented, what they do is they bring men from Poland. Now they have some others there too, but their goal in the 2 years work there is that they enculturate them in terms of language and in terms of cultural patterns in the United States. As a team, we were very impressed with what they were doing. And then they can move on to other dioceses and continue. But the lack of enculturation, some of the stories are weepable of the mismatch there. And it's not only language, but
Culture.
it's more than that. So, but things could be done about that. The Bishops' Conference could develop an enculturation program for the people we bring in. So,
And there are some good ones there. Unfortunately, that too often the bishops are bringing priests in just to fill a slot. And I've heard stories about somebody meeting up at the airport and bringing them right to the parish. And that's
terrible.
absolutely no enculturation, no formation. But I've got good experiences with priests that come from a variety of cultures who had 2 years of enculturation before they even came here.
Yes.
And they work out quite well. So there's a variety. I think without discounting anything that's being said and realizing it's not the ultimate solution for our situation, it does remind people that we're part of a global church, and the North American church is too self-referential and too insulated, and without that symbol of Catholicism from having somebody from another place. And I also think we have to be, as white people, a little bit careful about, what we have to say about people's accents and everything else, because part of it is we can adjust. The priest has to do his part in terms of being understood, but people also can train their ear a little bit, right? It may not help with mass attendance if you're begging people to come to church, but then I think the question is about discipleship. If we have to be begging people to come to church in the first place.
Well, it's almost time to close up. And I guess, as a woman in the church who's taught in 3 seminaries and was happy to go elsewhere in my life, I think I speak for many women who express a deep love for the church, but an incredible frustration with the church. I have a friend who's maybe on this tonight and probably wouldn't want to say it, but she always says to me, if you substituted Black every time the church talks about women, the church wouldn't get away with what it's saying. And I think it's important to know, Bishop Tom Zena's a good friend of mine, that there's plenty of frustration to go around. But I think those of us who love the church are still there and very hopeful and very grateful for all of you tonight to talk to us and share your thoughts about the priesthood. And hopefully the people of God will be served by good priest ministers, whether they're male or female. God created them. So thank you and good night, everyone. And to our audience at home, good night. Wednesday of next week, I'll be in Cincinnati at Xavier University, where we'll be doing our Spirit Alive Vatican II webinar series that will continue beyond Gaudium et Spes on March 1st. We'll do that series from Santa Clara on women since Vatican II, and we have the great honor of having Cardinal McElroy do our concluding session on March 15th. So if you can join us, great. If you can't, you can catch the recording. So good night from Brooklyn, New York, wherever you are. Have a peaceful night. God bless.
Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye, Zini, Bishop.
Bye.
Bye.
Diane.